19th century foreign policy was complicated business. This was a truly multipolar world order, with multiple expansionist empires bumping up against one another. Today, we can see how the story ended. The geopolitical precursors of the 19th century exploded into the First World War, a conflict which plunged the powers of Europe into a storm of mechanical and industrial violence. The question of this conflict's inevitability remains one of the most litigated in history. And while this video will not provide a direct answer to the question, it may give you a few clues as to where the true answer lies. To understand the First World War and everything that came after it, one has to understand the European order from which it sprung. And at the heart of this order was one man in particular, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was not just any regular statesman. He was the man who forged the German Empire, a state central to so much of what came to pass in the 20th century. He was the fabled Iron Chancellor, Germany's architect and its founder, the man who oversaw its astonishing rise throughout the course of the 19th century. Bismarck's foreign policy is legendary for good reason, and in the following two videos we'll examine the major episodes contained within it. Before we get started though, allow me to make a few disclaimers. Given the sheer depth and complexity of 19th century international relations, I've decided to narrow the scope of our examination. First of all, we will not be discussing Bismarck's foreign policy in the lead up to Germany's unification. If you'd like to learn more about that subject, I've provided some materials in the description below. Secondly, we will not be looking at Germany's colonial empire. Instead, we will look exclusively at Bismarck's balance of power diplomacy in Europe. So with that, let's begin. The German Empire was constituted on the 18th of January 1871, when the southern German states, save for Austria, agreed to unify with Prussia. It can't be stressed enough just how much this event changed world politics. First, there were the means. Bismarck waged 3 bloody wars to achieve unification. First against Denmark, then Austria, and then finally France. The defeat of Austria in 1866 ended the Austrian-Prussian rivalry for dominion of the German-speaking states, and with that essentially guaranteed that any future Germany would be dominated by Prussia, and therefore by Bismarck and the Hohenzollern dynasty. This had manifold consequences, as we'll see shortly, but an even more immediate issue concerned the defeat of France. You have to understand that at this time France was a global power. Only several decades prior, it had dominated the German Confederation through Napoleon, before being rolled back and ultimately defeated by a coalition which included Britain and Russia. The idea that a ragtag union of Germanic states would not only cross the Rhine, but actually defeat France in battle was utterly inconceivable, which made it all the more psychologically devastating when it actually happened. Bismarck knew from the very beginning that to unify the German states, he would have to fight France, for they were not going to simply stand by and allow a new hegemon to be birthed right on their doorstep. And so with the help of the Prussian military, namely the brilliant generals Roon and Moltke, Prussia imposed a crushing defeat on France. The settlement which followed was no less easy for them to stomach. A huge financial indemnity was imposed on the country. The French military was dramatically cut down to size. And most famously, the two states of Alsace and Lorraine were annexed to the German Empire. These conditions were absolutely humiliating to France, and essentially made her irreconcilable to Germany, an axiom of European politics which would remain unchanged all the way up until the end of the Second World War. Those were the means, and then there were the ends. Beyond alienating France, the creation of the German Empire had permanently altered the European balance of power. The freshly minted empire was now one among 5 major players in the European system, which included France, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Britain. And then there were also other players, like the newly unified Kingdom of Italy and the receding Ottoman Empire, both of whom also played a prominent role in the European balance of power. All of this is to say that Germany had just entered into an incredibly dynamic and multipolar system, where skill in diplomacy and alliance building would be of the utmost importance. Now is probably a good time then to explain Germany's post-unification objectives. Basically, Bismarck no longer had any territorial ambitions which he wished to satisfy. Instead, he wanted to focus on consolidating the gains he and his generals had secured in 1871. This meant integrating the various religious and ethnic minorities already contained within its borders, creating imperial institutions which could sublimate regional loyalties into national ones, and facilitating Germany's industrial and economic expansion. Thus, Bismarck's main objective in foreign affairs became the maintenance of peace. Any European war, regardless of its belligerence or location, would have likely seen Germany involved. And in such a war, it would have only found itself fighting for someone else's interests. This meant that Germany had to engage in sophisticated alliance building to both conserve the peace and prevent its own encirclement. So what did this mean in practice? Well, as discussed, Bismarck's main problem was France. While she had been defeated and substantially weakened, France would eventually rearm and seek vengeance for the defeats inflicted in 1871. The annexation of Alsace-Lorraine gave this rivalry a particularly charged focal point, with its requisition becoming a mainstay of French foreign policy. Correspondingly, for Bismarck, strategic isolation of France became a mainstay of his foreign policy. His biggest fear in this respect was an alliance between France, Russia, and Austria-Hungary, as this would have surrounded Germany on three fronts and potentially led to its disintegration. He thus sought to reconcile with Russia, Austria, or both, and become one of three within Europe's system of five powers. Over the course of his chancellorship, he oscillated between three permutations in particular. These were Germany, Austria, Russia, Germany, Austria, Britain, and Germany, Russia, Britain. As we'll see, each combination had its own strengths and weaknesses, but it's a testament to Bismarck's skill that he never overcommitted himself to one option, and instead remained highly flexible. Given how incredibly crisis-prone Europe was during this time, this flexibility proved indispensable, as Germany was able to weather several close calls and avoid isolation. Nevertheless, the first option Bismarck gravitated towards was Germany, Austria, Russia, and this took the form of the Three Emperors League. The Dreikaiserbund, or League of the Three Emperors, was a formal alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, signed in 1873. The initial agreement only lasted for 5 years, but it showed great initial success. For one, it allowed the three powers to coordinate efforts on the suppression of Polish nationalism, a movement which threatened each of their respective spheres of influence. It also allowed them to coordinate efforts on the growing socialist threat, which was a menace to each of their respective monarchies. Most importantly, though, it isolated France and Britain, satisfying the three powers in distinct ways. For Germany, the isolation of France was advantageous for obvious reasons. But similarly, for Russia, the isolation of Britain proved just as pertinent. Russia and Britain were at this time engaged in great power competition in Asia, a saga known as the Great Game, in which both sides attempted to erode the other's sphere of influence. So the Union had a certain strategic logic, as each party to the alliance benefited from the isolation of France and Britain respectively. The critical weakness, however, lay in the issue of the Balkans, where Austrian and Russian interests were diametrically opposed. For most of the 19th and 20th centuries, the Balkans were a geopolitical minefield in the game of great power politics. Indeed, it became ground zero for the First World War, when the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Bosnia, kicking off a chain reaction which ended in full-blown continental war. As it so happened, the Balkans were no less stable during Bismarck's time. The primary reason for this were just the sheer number of overlapping interests there. To start, the Ottoman Empire held a significant tract of territory to the south of Bulgaria and Serbia. These territories had been administered for hundreds of years, albeit with a considerable degree of oppression. In this connection, both Austria and Britain saw Ottoman influence as a necessary counterweight to Russia. Austria, for one, feared that pan-Slavic nationalism, spurred on by Russia in the face of retreating Ottoman influence, would not only get in the way of its own designs on the region, but also arouse nationalist feelings within its own empire. Britain, on the other hand, feared that Russian influence in the southern Balkans could provide it with access to ports in the Mediterranean Ocean, and thereby allow it to threaten the Suez Canal. It bears worth repeating that the Suez Canal was Britain's key to India, and its fortification had become a virtual dogma of British strategic thinking. For Germany, it had no direct interests in the Balkans, but its attention was often drawn there owing to its close relations with the other powers. Indeed, due to its perceived neutrality, Bismarck was often called upon to adjudicate the region's disputes, which tended to be delicate and highly contentious. As Christian revanchism and pan-Slavic nationalism flared up in the face of a retreating Ottoman Empire, disputes over the Balkan territories were pushed to the fore. Starting in 1875, a series of uprisings broke out against Ottoman rule in the Balkans. These started in Herzegovina before eventually spreading to Bulgaria in 1876. Now, Bismarck initially welcomed the uprisings, for they diverted attention away from Franco-German tensions and otherwise posed no direct threat to Germany's strategic interests. But his attitude later changed. In this instance, while the issues associated with the Ottoman Empire's decline only affected Germany indirectly, if Austria and Russia came to blows over the issue, then Bismarck may have been forced to choose between them, in which case the rejected suitor would soon find an embrace in France. Similarly, should Russia and Britain have come to blows, then Austria, much in the same way as it had done during the Crimean War, may have been tempted to intervene, in which case all three of Germany's eligible alliance partners would have been at war. In order to avoid such a chain reaction, Bismarck insisted that the other two parties to the Three Emperors League reach an agreement over the partition of the Balkans before committing to action there. It was only after tensions had escalated did this actually happen. In June of 1876, both Serbia and Montenegro declared war on the Ottoman Empire, sparking a full-blown regional crisis. Austria and Russia then began negotiations at Bismarck's insistence. On July 8th, Kaiser Franz Joseph I and Tsar Alexander II met in the city of Reichstadt in Bohemia, where their respective foreign ministers, Wala Andrisi and Alexander Gorchakov, worked out an agreement over the partition of Ottoman possessions in the northern Balkans. While no written text of the agreement exists, the ministers came to an understanding that Austria-Hungary would annex Bosnia and Herzegovina, while Russia would annex Romania's Bessarabia, which it had lost during the Crimean War. Both states agreed that Bulgaria would become independent and autonomous. Their willingness to come to terms was elevated by the fact that neither had been successful in reaching an agreement with Britain, whose position on the Balkans appeared increasingly uncertain. In the past, Britain had sought to preserve the Ottoman Empire's territorial integrity as a means of checking Russian and French influence in the Far East. But as news circulated on the brutality with which the Ottoman Turks were oppressing Bulgarian Christians, British public opinion soon turned against supporting the Ottoman Empire. This popular revulsion raised doubts among the Russian elite as to whether Britain would stand in the way should Russia decide to go to war against the Ottomans or the Austrians. Russia's foreign minister Alexander Gorchakov began testing the waters. On October 1st, 1876, he asked German diplomats for an answer to the question, quote, "Would Germany act as Russia did in 1870 if Russia went to war with Austria?" In this way, Bismarck had been presented with the exact kind of question he wished to avoid, namely that of having to choose between Austria and Russia. Should Russia and Turkey go to war, Germany would have encouraged Austria to keep the peace. But if Russia and Austria went to war, then Germany would be placed in a deeply precarious position. Should either the Tsarist or Habsburg dynasties suffer a lasting blow to their respective power, then Germany's balance of power flexibility vis-a-vis France would be permanently compromised. As Bismarck aptly noted, quote, "We could indeed endure that our friends should win or lose battles against one another, but not that one of the two should be so severely wounded and injured that its position as an independent great power participating in European affairs would be endangered." His answer to Gorchakov, therefore, sought to place Russia in an even more inflexible position. He replied, quote, "As compensation for our support in the Eastern crisis, a guarantee of Alsace-Lorraine would be acceptable." Needless to say, the offer was promptly turned down by the Russians. Bismarck's unwillingness to back Russia against Austria had therefore forced the Tsar to give up on the idea of going to war against both powers. He thus had two options. One, to come to a formal agreement with Austria-Hungary over the fruits of a Russian war with Turkey, or two, to abandon any idea of such a war in the first place. He went with the former. On January 15, 1877, representatives from both the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires signed a military convention in Budapest, whereby the Austrians imposed their price for benevolent neutrality in the looming war. The first agreement specified Austria's rights should a partition of Ottoman possessions take place. Pursuant to this, Austria was permitted to occupy Bosnia and Herzegovina, but not extend its military operations into either Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria, or Montenegro. The second agreement, on the other hand, specified the political settlement that would follow should either Russia emerge victorious or should the Ottoman Empire dissolve in the aftermath. Here, Russia would be permitted to annex Bessarabia and the broader frontier it lost in 1856. But no greater Slavic state would be constructed. Instead, Albania, Bulgaria, and the bordering Rumelia would be constituted into independent states, while Constantinople, today known as Istanbul, would become a free city. In this sense, Russia stood to gain relatively little from a war with the Ottoman Empire. But by this stage, pan-Slavic agitation within the Russian press and the military had made it too difficult for Gorchakov and Alexander to back out. The prospect of war only became more inexorable as the Ottomans refused to yield to diplomatic pressure. Bismarck responded by urging them to go to war, but on behalf of their own interests. At this stage, he still wanted to prove Germany's value as an ally, and did not want to frustrate the ambitions of pan-Slavic elites whose anger had to be channeled somewhere. The Constantinople agreements had also ruled out war with Austria, and given the complete lack of interventionist will in Great Britain, this effectively guaranteed that the conflict would be localized. Thus, on April 24, 1877, the Tsar declared war on Turkey. In the following months, Russia and Turkey battled it out in the Balkans, the Caucasus, and the Black Sea. For Germany, the fact that Austria had been able to extract favorable terms from Russia in exchange for its neutrality meant that the Three Emperors League remained as stable as could be. Moreover, Russian military involvement in the region further diminished its likelihood of seeking rapprochement with France, a huge benefit for Germany. In June 1887, Bismarck wrote of the empire's strategic predicament in what became known as the Kissinger Dictation. In essence, he hoped that out of the various conflicts of interest between Europe's great powers, there would emerge a situation where all of them, with the exception of France, of course, would eventually compete for Germany's support. This meant ironing out the various disputes among them, such as the Balkan disagreement between Austria and Russia, and the Asian disagreement between Russia and Britain. In this connection, Germany would not be forced to commit to any one of them in the event of a crisis, and could instead remain flexible. Bismarck seemed to get his way. 7 months after the outbreak of war, the Russian Empire emerged victorious, signing the Treaty of San Stefano on the outskirts of Constantinople. The agreement saw Romania, Montenegro, and Serbia recognized as independent states, as well as the creation of a greater Bulgarian state, which was to receive full autonomy from the Ottoman Empire. Austria-Hungary and Britain, however, were deeply offended by the terms of the treaty. On the one hand, the petition of the new Bulgarian state gave it access to ports in the southern Mediterranean, whose access might be extended to the Russian Empire and therefore permit it to threaten Britain in Egypt. On the other hand, the size of the new Bulgarian state was interpreted as a violation of the Reichstag and Budapest agreements Austria-Hungary had formalized with Russia nearly a year earlier. Agreements which explicitly guaranteed that a pan-Slavic state would not be created in the Balkans. Both empires were willing to go to war over the issue, and with Russia both financially and militarily exhausted, it was forced to come to the negotiating table. Thus, the great powers met to resolve the matter at the Congress of Berlin. In the aftermath of the Russo-Turkish War, the Congress of Berlin served as a means of revising the Treaty of San Stefano in a manner which accorded to each of the great powers' interests. Britain sought to deny Russia access to the southern Mediterranean. Austria-Hungary sought to prevent the creation of a pan-Slavic state near its frontier. And Russia sought to solidify its gains to the greatest extent possible. For Germany, none of its direct interests were really at stake. Instead, Bismarck sought to adjudicate the Congress fairly, and demonstrate his credibility as a, quote, honest broker. He thus sought to find an amicable compromise between Russia and Austria in a manner which would both stabilize the Balkans and preserve the Three Emperors League. He also sought to develop greater rapport with Great Britain, whose Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, held a perennial distrust of Bismarck up until that point. The Congress lasted a full month, and each of the powers presented their case for modifying the treaty. Kaiser Franz Josef and Austrian Foreign Minister Huala Andrisi refused to abdicate from their interpretation of the Reichstag and Budapest agreements they formalized with Russia. They were particularly concerned about the size of the Bulgarian state, which they saw as a fundamental violation of the agreements. Moreover, Russia's 2-year occupation of the region appeared to confirm that Bulgaria would become nothing more than a Russian client state. Benjamin Disraeli and Lord Salisbury, the Foreign Minister of Great Britain, reiterated their objections. Salisbury argued that the territorial rearrangements would give Russia effective control of the Black Sea, that the imposition of a large and crippling war indemnity would give Russia coercive power over Turkey, and that the whole combination of treaty provisions would cost the Ottoman Empire its independence, permanently shifting the maritime balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean, and thereby damaging Britain's interests. Although the Russians refused to submit to British demands that they withdraw their forces back from the gates of Constantinople, they eventually settled on an agreement with them. The latter retained Cyprus and achieved a 3/5 reduction in the size of Bulgaria. Turkey retained dominion of the coastline west of Constantinople, while Britain acceded to the expansion of Serbia and Montenegro. Russia annexed Bessarabia, while Bulgaria was split into two, with eastern Rumelia remaining under Ottoman administration. Overall, while the settlement prevented the outbreak of an immediate follow-up war, Russian pan-Slavists and nationalists walked away from the Congress incredibly disappointed. They were particularly indignant over the failure of Germany and Austria to shield them from what they saw as excessive British demands. In this respect, while Bismarck succeeded in dispelling British suspicions that Germany posed a risk to European peace, this had come at the cost of alienating Russia. Indeed, as time went on, Bismarck found it increasingly difficult to keep them in the fold. Part of the reason why Bismarck pursued the League of the Three Emperors in the first place was so that he could impose a greater degree of control over conflicts arising in the Balkans. Conflicts that, if left unchecked, might embroil one or more of his potential allies in a self-destructive war. While he was initially successful in this regard, it did eventually lead to the dissolution of the Three Emperors League. This was due to the fact that Russian chauvinists had decided to turn him into a scapegoat over their relative lack of rewards in the recent war. Henry Kissinger argued in his landmark text Diplomacy that German-Russian estrangement had its roots in Bismarck's decision to prioritize relations with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria-Hungary was the common partner in both of the tripartite combinations that Bismarck attempted to construct for Germany. The reasons for this were fairly straightforward. Austria was the only other central power in the European system, which meant that it shared the same vulnerability of encirclement as Germany. The two had a shared history and culture, with the Austrian monarchy itself being of German extraction. And above all else, Germany had a vested interest in keeping Austria-Hungary solvent. Russia, Turkey, and the various other states in the Balkans hated the empire and wanted to see it dissolved. Not only would this have sparked a continental war, but it would have shifted the balance of power against Germany's favour, as other players such as Italy, Russia, and Turkey would have moved in to absorb its territory. In addition to this were the domestic considerations. Had the Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved, Catholic Austria would have likely sought unification with Germany, which in turn would have disturbed the Protestant-denominated Prussian state's dominance within the imperial structure. Bismarck sought to preserve the special status of Prussia, which was central not only to the consolidation of the empire, but also to the Hohenzollern monarchy and his personal position as Chancellor. Consequently, the relationship between Austria-Hungary and Germany became one of relative codependency. Since the Balkans were the only site of potential expansion for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, this brought it into natural antagonism with Russia, who sought to project its own influence through the Slavic populations of the region. As such, Austria sought out Germany as a check on Russian aggression and as a means of buttressing its own claims. Concordantly, Germany sought out Austria as a means of avoiding strategic isolation, as well as to prevent the devastating consequences which would follow in the wake of its destruction. In this sense, a good case can be made for Kissinger's assessment. But the inverse question also warrants interrogation. That is, why didn't Bismarck prioritize Russian relations over Austro-Hungarian ones? Bismarck was only too aware of the dangers which flowed from Franco-Russian rapprochement and the associated prospect of a war on two fronts. Russia was significantly larger and more powerful than Austria-Hungary, who, besides Turkey, would have been the weakest among the European powers. So why not compromise the Austrian relationship in favor of the Russian? Well, part of the problem was just how much of a slippery slope this strategic vector was. Even small concessions to Russia, like the approval of a greater Bulgarian state, had the potential to quickly spiral out of control. The more and more that Russia consolidated its power in the Balkans, the less compromising it would have to be towards Germany and Austria. As Russia strengthened its sphere of influence, it would have been able to more brazenly threaten the breakup of Austria-Hungary and in turn elevate its strategic position vis-à-vis Germany. In this vein, the internal fragility of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, combined with the inherent danger of the Balkans, made giving in to the Russian option a rather dangerous prospect. In the end, it took an executor of Bismarck's skill to find a suitable balance between the interests of the two powers, in such a way which preserved the relative standing of Germany. It was for these reasons that Bismarck eventually consecrated the dual alliance, which was then extended to the Triple Alliance of 1881, which in turn was supplemented by the Reinsurance Treaty of 1887, a top-secret agreement with Russia which specified a range of defensive protocols. This complex system of interwoven agreements would ultimately come crashing down after the accession of Wilhelm II to the throne, and Bismarck's dismissal shortly thereafter. If you would like to know how this happened and where this whole precarious story ends, then come join me in part 2, where we'll complete our examination of Bismarck's foreign policy legacy.